during this my sessions talking about our country. I know that everybody's concerned, depending upon how old you are. You would even though we try to be positive, upbeat people, because we're just passing through, headed to our ultimate destination, our ultimate kingdom. And yet, if we're Americans, we're concerned about so much stuff that's been going on for so long now, and the overall deterioration of our nation, erosion of our values. So I feel like it's good for us to go back and revisit what the Bible says about some of these things, and that's why I thought, well, let's talk about the government, the country. What was the intention of the founders, but more specifically, what does the Bible teach about what's going on? And you remember last week we began by talking about the fact that, yes, government's authorized by God, and it has a very specifically, divinely assigned purpose. Now think about that. Nobody's free to just go through life and do what they want to do. Everyone is under obligation to follow God's will. They may not choose to do that, but everybody's supposed to. And the founders of our country even had the attitude, you don't have a right to just go set up a country. Does a person have a right to just go start a church and call it the Fifth Ascension Charismatic whatever? No, the Bible teaches nobody has a right to do that. You're not authorized. You don't have God's permission. Well, the founders believed the only way you could set up a government in a country is if God approved of it. And so they went out of their way to give the rationale for why they were convinced that God was approving of what they were doing. And it's all over the place in their writings. And so, yes, the Bible teaches you can set up a government, and it teaches what God intends for the purpose of that government to be. John Jay, of course, first Chief Justice, first U.S. Supreme Court, described the purpose of government as protecting the people from domestic and foreign aggression. So, there it is, very succinct. That's the point. How many Americans know this? If you just ask parents, take out a piece of paper and ask Americans, write down on paper, what's the point of government? Why even have a government? Civil government. You'd get all kinds of stuff. But the Bible articulates God's view on it. Then we turn to the question of unalienable rights and found out, even though that word's not in the Bible as far as I know, there might be a Hebrew or Greek equivalent. It's all over the place in the Bible because God created us in His own image. And by virtue of the fact that we are human beings created by God, He has invested us. He's infused in us very specific features of our nature, what it means to be human, and that's what the founders called unalienable. That is, they're yours, whether you like it or not. God inbuilt it into you, and as a result, there are certain guidelines that govern those, that come from God. And it's the purpose of government to make certain that those are not infringed in your life. What if somebody right now comes to this door here with a submachine gun and comes through and points it at all of us? Well, see, they are already infringing upon certain rights and liberties that we possess. Forget about whether we're Americans. Simply because we're human beings that God created us. That person is doing wrong in God's sight. Government ought to underscore and support and affirm God's view on such matters. So it's the purpose of government to make certain that that doesn't happen to us. And then we spend a little bit of time talking about what are these. And I've never tried to make an exhaustive list, but I took you through life. I mean, it's clear where life comes from. It doesn't come from mom and dad. It comes from God. Passage after passage articulates that point. Therefore, neither you nor anybody else has a right to take that life, except under the conditions that God authorizes your life to be taken. We have liberty. The more I think about that term there, the more I realize how much our civilization has lost connection with it. My generation, the baby boomers in the 60s, thought freedom was, I can do whatever I want to do my own thing. But what God says is, look, you're on this planet for a short period of time to prepare for eternity. You're deciding where you want to spend eternity. And therefore, I've given you volition, will, freedom to make your own choices. And here's the choices you ought to make, and I hope you will do them. I love you so much that I've made all the provision I can without infringing and interfering with your right to make your own choice. Well, that's freedom. And you think about the people, for example, in our own country that are in rough situations where they're living hand to mouth, they're having difficulty even surviving. Well, why? Well, because they chose to drop out of school, they chose to take drugs at an early age, they chose, you see. Now, all of us have made foolish decisions that have been harmful to our lives. But we need to understand that so much of the misery in the world is self-inflicted. And as Christians, we want to try to help people as best we can, but we also have no right to interfere with choices that people make, any more than God does. The pursuit of happiness. God wants people to be happy on this planet. Look at what all He put here on this planet that has no real logical reason other than it's just beautiful and gives us joy and pleasure. Passage after passage indicates God's will on that matter. We talked about private property. This was a big thing with the founders. That includes your own life. That's your property. And no government has a right to come in and interfere with your property unless you give them permission to do so through taxation and so forth. We didn't talk about family relations. Notice that God doesn't guarantee anybody a marriage. One fellow might be so ugly that no one wants to marry him. Although women will put up with an awful lot, won't they? Mine sure has. But do you have a right to have a scriptural marriage based upon God's? Absolutely. Do you have a right to have children if there's not some, genetic reason why you can't? And then you have the right to rear those children in very specific ways stipulated in Scripture? Yes, you do. What about the right to worship? This was another big one with the founders. In fact, that's why the Pilgrims 150 years before the founding left England. That was why. That was the reason. We don't want government controlled by a state religion to tell us how to interpret the Bible and how to worship the God of the Bible. That was their attitude. And notice then that God has built into your rights as a human being the right to decide how you're going to worship and who you're going to worship. Now, God doesn't want you to go out here and worship a tree, but you've got that freedom to do so. He wants everybody to, of course, worship Him. Now, the founders understood that there have to be some limitations on that by virtue of the fact that people will use religion to justify doing immoral things or even to harm other people. What has Islam done for its 1,400-year history? Still to this day. What did the Mormon Church do in the late 1800s in the territories of Utah and Idaho? Plural marriages. And when our courts went after them, we were still moral at that time, their lawyers argued, this is freedom of religion. This is part of our religion. You know what the court said? Our whole civilization, Christian civilization throughout the world, is built upon the platform of one man, one woman for life. And you cannot justify altering that based on your alleged religion. That was their argument. Go read the court cases. So that was the only two exceptions to the infringement of unalienable rights with regard to religion and worship. We have a little bit of time here just to spend on this. This merits so much more. I grew up in Churches of Christ, and my dad was in World War II and chose to be a non-combatant, worked in hospital settings. I kind of grew up with that mentality and that thinking. And really, not until I started digging into this did I realize where these guys were coming from. Here's the fellow that's gone down in history as the father or firebrand of the revolution. Look what he said, Samuel Adams from Boston, where he says that, these are the debates that were held in his home state of Massachusetts trying to ratify the Constitution. He said, the Constitution must not ever be permitted to prevent the rank and file of Americans who are peaceable from keeping their own arms. Now, that's just all there is to it. I'm telling you, that was the attitude of all the founders. I don't believe you could find an exception to that. And here is George Mason, who's gone down in history as the father of the Bill of Rights. That's the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. I guess he knows. What is the militia? They had these little militias. Here's the British Empire, and all of our guys are British citizens until they broke away. And yet they formed militias all over those colonies. Well, what is the militia? I'm hearing people say in the media today in their efforts to control guns and so forth, no, that's not that, and blah, blah, blah. Yes, it is. Look what he said. Well, who's the militia? It's everybody. It's all Americans. And to disarm the people is the best and most effectual way to enslave them. If I'd read that 20 years ago, I thought, interesting. I've heard that in other countries. I never would have dreamed it would describe the kinds of things that are going on in our country. What about James Madison, who co-wrote with two other founders the Federalist Papers? The ultimate authority resides in the people alone. The advantage of being armed. Look at this statement made over 200 years ago. Which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. That's still the case today. You want to make a trip to China or any number of countries. You not only can't take a gun into their country, if you live there, you couldn't have one. I saw where in China, these two fellows went into a bus station and killed about 20 or 30 people. Not with guns. They're not allowed to have guns. They did it with knives. So much for gun control. You do remember that Cain killed his brother with a 30-06 or something like that, right? That's not the problem in our country. And there has to be ulterior motives to try to do that, to try to eliminate that. I'm not a big gun advocate. I didn't grow up hunting, like probably most people in Alabama did. But I can see the reasoning and the rationale that was intended from the beginning, and I'm going to show you what the Bible says too. Gun control is like trying to reduce drunk driving by making it tougher for the sober people to own cars. Does the Bible teach that God has granted you the right to self-preservation? It really does. And again, this is so abbreviated, we don't have time to go into detail. I'll just pull out a few verses here and there that show God's approval. For example, you remember when Abraham was forced to go to rescue his nephew who had been captured by these renegade kings there in that part of the world. And so he armed 318 of his trained servants, and they went and they attacked the guys who had taken Lot hostage. And whenever Abraham and them came back, this is a priest of God, right? Hebrews makes clear Melchizedek was an authorized priest of God. And he comes out and blesses Abraham and says, who made it possible for you to do this? It was God. He blessed you in that endeavor. So was God pleased with Abraham's, notice, self-defensive. I've been astounded at how many times the founders said the Revolutionary War was self-defensive. They were not the aggressors, and they wanted that understood for all the world and for all of history. Isn't that interesting? Why did they emphasize that? Because the Bible does. What about under the law of Moses? If someone breaks into your house at night and you kill him, there's no blood guiltiness for that from God's perspective. Why? You're defending yourself. It's a self-defensive situation. The text goes ahead and talks about if it's during the day, there are other issues, but I'm convinced that what's going on there is not that it wouldn't be appropriate for you to defend yourself in your own home in broad daylight, but because there has to be clarification made as to whether or not it was actually a self-defensive activity. People get murdered in homes, And it's not because they've broken in or anything like that. Something for you to study and to think about, and to feel free to give me any input that you want to give me on the matter. What about moving on down to the captivity period shortly thereafter? Nehemiah, you remember they returned. Nehemiah received permission from the conquering king to return to their homeland, to rebuild their homes and so forth, the temple. And they kept having marauders come in and frustrate their efforts. So they took necessary steps in order to defend themselves and protect themselves from these encroachments. Look at this also from chapter 4. I wish we had time to go through the whole chapter, but basically the essence of it is some are standing guard, some have a trowel in their hand and their sword in the other. They have to be prepared to defend themselves as they're engaging in this. And of course, notice the terminology here that is used. Our God will fight for us. He was not mistaken on that point. God approved of all of this. So we have to sort through these issues compared to the things that we've been hearing incessantly by the propaganda of the media and so forth. Moving over to John 18. As a child, I remember, reading this. My kingdom's not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight. And I thought, okay, Christians don't fight. They don't get into any sort of an armed conflict. That's not Christian to do that. Well, but notice that that's not what Jesus was saying. He was convincing Pilate, it was obviously right for his disciples to defend him. But he explained to Pilate, they're not doing it because this is not your normal, trying to overthrow the government situation. If we're talking about a national setting, my servants would fight. He's saying they would have a right to fight. They would have a right to engage in self-defense. What's going on here is not the establishment of a physical kingdom, but if that were the case, they would have a right to justly defend me and prevent me from being arrested. And Jesus made this point several times to them whenever he said that, like when Paul whipped out his sword. His point to Peter, did I say Paul? Peter, was that you need to allow this to take place. Why? Because it's inappropriate for you to have done that? No. Because I need to be arrested so that God's redemptive scheme can be fulfilled. So don't try to interfere with that. Well, we don't have time to go into this anymore, but here's 7 of the unalienable rights that are embedded in Scripture. The founders understood them, and they wove into their conceptions of government and the founding of a nation these very principles. Well, if you poll the average American today, what do you think they would say the government ought to be providing and doing? This healthcare thing was a big thing, right? I have no idea how you feel about that. I'm simply telling you that the Bible teaches that's not an unalienable right, and it's not the purpose of government. If I had a beach house down on the Gulf and a hurricane came up and destroyed it, I guess it'd be nice if the government would pay for it. But that's not its purpose. Any more than if you go home tonight and there was a strong wind last night and a tree fell off and hit part of your house or landed on your car, the government's supposed to fix that for you. There's no end to that, you see. It's a warped understanding of why we even have a government. What's happened? Our school system has stopped teaching all of these basic principles. And our churches have stopped teaching the Bible on these matters. And consequently, our people are confused. And they stand in line to get free phones, free food, free this, free that. I'm telling you that this is a spiritual issue. That God doesn't want his people to be beggars. Remember what David said about that? I've never seen the righteous begging bread. Think about that. Doesn't the Bible teach that if you're striving to live for God and be faithful to God, he'll bless you and take care of you? So do you not see that the people that are out here, they do in Montgomery now, it used to be against the law, but I guess with COVID and everything, a lot of things are permitted. I don't know about around here, but there are people out just all over the place panhandling. Well, I'm telling you, Christians don't do that. It's not right. And it's avoiding what the Bible teaches is the solution to their problems. Solutions. The Bible's very clear about it. Don't have time to go into all of that. We'll touch some of these things maybe in a later lesson. But notice none of these have to do with the role of the federal government. Now let's move into the question of taxation a little bit, because I really feel like the time has come for preachers and churches to study and to think through this matter of socialism and specifically Marxism. Again, I believe we're sitting ducks as a nation and as the church with regard to the extent to which these ideas are making headway in our culture, which I guarantee you the World War II generation would not have tolerated. They fought World War II over fascism, and granted, they kind of saddled up there next to the communists to assist, but they didn't like it. That's why Patton said, you know what? We're going to have to fight the Russians sooner or later. We just will do it while we got the military over there. And Eisenhower thought he was crazy. But look what happened after that, the Cold War, and how many years did it last? Why? Because we have clashing ideologies. And ours is based on the Bible, and theirs isn't. And that's the case with many countries in the world. Both the founders and the Bible indicate that government intrusion must be kept to a minimum so that each citizen can live his or her life before God without interference. The more power the people entrust with government officials, the more encroachments on your personal liberty, your money, the more controlling they'll even regulate your personal behavior. You know, I remember in the 60s, wasn't it, that they made the seatbelt law? You know, as a kid, I thought, okay, whatever. Well, now I can look back and see they didn't have a right to do that. It's one thing to tell Americans, hey, we've done a bunch of research and we found out that far more people die in auto accidents when they're not wearing their seatbelt than those who do. That's fine. That's what government ought to do, educate. But they didn't have a right to then tell us where to sit in the car, what you can and can't do. That's an infringement on your rights. I know that sounds cockeyed because we've gone so far in our culture. If you'll sit back and think about that and then do some research on this, you'll see government has just gradually encroached more and more. You know, we have an example of that in 1 Samuel chapter 8. You remember when Israel clamored for a king? What were they clamoring for? Government. We want more government, which was an insult to God. I mean, Samuel went to him and said, you know, they're rejecting me. And God said, no, they're not. They're rejecting me. Now you go back and tell them what's going to happen. And you go read the description tonight if you don't remember it, 1 Samuel chapter 8. It's not what you would expect. Like, you know, well, you're going to find out that I was better than what you thought or anything like that. It was, here's what the government's going to do. They are going to start getting into your life and taking your resources and taking your young people to make them serve them and blah, blah. It's government encroachment, tyranny, which the founders, that term they used over and over and over to say that's what was happening to them. They recognized the need to collect taxes. Nothing wrong with taxation from the government. In fact, you can't have a government without it. That's the whole point. If you're going to get together a bunch of individuals on their own and form a government that will mutually assist them in these goals, then there's going to have to be money paid to it. That's fine. The Bible teaches that. But they did not want any more collected than was necessary to accomplish the very limited role of government. It has gotten all completely out of kilter. And if they were alive today, they would be shocked and displeased that government has been so far expanded beyond the original intentions and the government is extracting such a high percentage. I'm telling you, they wouldn't believe it, of what you pay to the government every year. And by the way, they also would be astounded that we would put up with it. Not that the Revolutionary War was primarily about taxation. We've been led to believe that in school. Taxation without representation, that wasn't the issue. The issue was government trying to take away from us what God has given to us, which they have no right to take. And you let them take a little, and they'll take a lot. So that's why they fussed about that 3 pence tax, Stamp Act. Wasn't the amount. They said it wasn't. It's not the amount here, it's the principle. There's no end to this. If government can take 5 cents from you, it can take your car and anything else it wants to take. It can strap you with all kinds of regulations where you can't even function financially. Am I describing pretty much what's happened? Why have so many of our businesses gone overseas? Because of government intrusion and intervention. And a lot of it, it's one thing to collect a bunch of money. It's another thing to do it over crazy things like, well, you're going to put a little bit too much stuff in the air there, and that's going to hurt the spotted owl, and that means far more to us than the population and people and jobs. So we have all this cockeyed atheistic thinking that has permeated our civilization. The welfare system, I have no doubt, because you see, they had people that were needy in 1776. They absolutely did. And I don't have time to talk to you about how they handled it. They handled it well and responsibly, but it was, and as Christian, with Christian charity, but it wasn't through the government. So, taxes must be consensual. And here's how they said you give your consent. You elect people that will go represent you and do what you tell them to do. If you feel like your taxes are too high, quit putting people in there that make your taxes high. Duh. But that's what we've done. Our people have done this for generations now. Answer that question. Do you feel like the government is using your money for illicit purposes for which you have not given your consent? Did you agree to provide cell phones for people? Did you know you're doing? You go look at your cell phone bill. They have it hidden and it's cryptic, but you are paying a fee every month to provide cell phones for other people. Now, as a loving Christian, are there people that you would like to help with a cell phone? Sure. But that's your choice and your decision, when and where and how much. The government has no right to squeeze that out of us like that. That's wrong. I'm telling you, it's wrong. It's injustice gone to seed. When our government and citizens follow unbiblical, covetous economic principles for several decades now, we should fully expect to stand on the brink of economic, catastrophic ruin. Are we? When elected officials think their job is to be money changers, that extract money from citizens and then turn around and redistribute it to who they think it ought to be distributed to, would you expect the government to become bloated, debt-ridden, and a thicket of economic confusion? Has it? All of this because of departures from biblical concepts and morality. This is morality. And the thinking of the founders themselves. If the central purpose of government is to protect citizens from both foreign and domestic thugs, enabling citizens to live free to pursue noble goals, then it's not the purpose of government to extract monies from some citizens in order to redistribute to others. The central purpose of government today has shifted from securing the rights of citizens and protecting them. It would even be okay if they took a lot of our money, but at least they still protected us. Do you feel safe all the time in your home? All the monies that ought to be spent to maintain law and order so that people can live safely without fear or threat. They're not even doing that. But I guarantee you they're sending a lot of money overseas to a lot of different groups and causes that you and I would not approve of one bit. Our government has run amok. Well, then their purpose is not to decide how much money to take from us and then what to spend it on. And look at the people that have lined up to get their piece of the pie. I'm disappointed that even Christians, I've met with members of the church all over this country, union men, and they look at me and they say, I vote politics because I want my pension and I want this and that and Social Security and all that. Our own people then can't see through the thicket of confusion and end up aiding and abetting things that they ought not to be aiding and abetting. No government or church has a right to exist if it does not conform to God's arrangement and the purpose that he stipulates. A government is authorized by God only if it conforms to biblical principles, morally, economically, judicially, legislatively, and executively. And, here's the sad thing. It used to be that the world around us didn't understand why America has excelled beyond all other nations in human history. And I think today the average foreigner doesn't know. They just want to come here because they know they can have a better life. But they don't know why. But Americans used to know why until the last 50 or 60 years, since World War II. And they don't know anymore. They don't know that the reason why our country has excelled is because of the original principles laid down that were based on the Bible and the founders openly saying to God, please bless us, we're doing this in harmony with your will. And I believe arguably you could say that's exactly what he did. Because it's so obvious how far we have excelled beyond. Read that book. Did I mention that 5,000 Year Leap last time? Kind of documents that, and a lot of other books that do the same thing. Well, now you see Americans cannot tell foreigners why we have it so good. Because they don't know. And now we have a sizable percentage of people who've been educated in our Ivy League schools and beyond that say the opposite. They hate America. This is a racist country. It was founded in racism. It's evil. It's capitalistic, and on it goes. I'm telling you, Americans for the first 100 and 200 years, they wouldn't believe this. So much propaganda, misinformation, outright lies and falsehood told about the founders. Bunch of racists. That's a lie. Well, they all owned slaves. That's a lie. Go look for yourself and find out how many of them did. Small percentage. The vast majority of the founders opposed it and did everything they could to eliminate it. And it eventually was. To a lot of bloodshed. By the way, who accomplished that? Well, over half the country. And just so much misinformation. It's astounding. As we lose our Christianity, we should expect to see more poverty. Why? Because widespread observance of Christian principles was what enabled our country to achieve what we achieved. So what? The Christian work ethic, concern for the aged and infirm, local charitable organizations. See, the government's taken over all that, and they do it poorly. But that was never the purpose of government. And it was working just fine without it. Political self-interest drove the welfare program and other things beginning in the 60s. If we don't have Christianity to hold civil society together as it has for so long, then what's the alternative? Well, we've got a lot of voices now, especially from these younger people. Oh, we need to be socialistic and communist and what, go to a monarchy? Well, of course, the popular thing right now is socialism. And by the way, in your mind, you ought to insert the word Marxism, because that's really where the people that are advocating this are coming from. They've openly said so. Well, what are we talking about? First of all, think about these definitions that are just standard definitions out of the dictionary. A way of organizing a society in which major industries are owned and controlled by the government rather than by individual people and companies. Any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. A system of society or group living in which there is no private property. A system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. A stage of society in Marxist theory transitional from capitalism and communism and distinguished by unequal distribution of goods and pay according to work done. Look at this statement this fellow made in the Sun Centennial just last year. The verdict is in, and contrary to what socialists say, capitalism with all its warts is the preferred economic system to bring the masses out of poverty and to make them productive citizens in our country and in countries around the world. Capitalism rewards merit, socialism rewards mediocrity. The Bible all over the place from beginning to end advocates capitalism. It does. What are the premier socialist countries on earth today in your lifetime? Well, here would be a very short list. Let's just look at Cuba for just a minute. What is the great socialist revolution that Castro instigated back in the 1950s? How's that worked out for them? Well, mostly state-run economy. Everybody gets free health care. Government-paid education at all levels, and numerous other social programs. Sounds like America, right? We're rapidly rushing toward that. Redistribution of wealth. The last statistic I checked, 2014, 1.2 million Cubans, about 10% of the island have left. And more would leave too if they could. This article came out a few years ago, Havana, Cuba. It's as if this city has been preserved. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Preserved in amber. Little appears to have changed in Cuba's capital since Fidel Castro took power. General Motors dinosaurs of the 40s and 50s roamed the plaza. See, there's all these 57 Chevys, and they're in pristine condition. But there are no new cars. Why? Cubans have been forbidden to buy new cars. Government won't let you. So you just have to keep fixing up the one you have. Cuban standard of living has deteriorated thanks to the communist government and the U.S. trade embargo and the disappearance of the Soviet Union's economic aid. They've been propping them up. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans live in substandard free housing. They line up to receive government rations of chicken, rice, and even sugar. The postal service is slow, expensive, and unreliable. As much as we gripe about the post office, we're not that far gone. Home telephones are all but non-existent. Internet access is severely restricted, mostly reserved for the government and tourist hotels. On the street, even a casual conversation can prompt a Cuban's criticism of Fidel and the government. I bet they don't say that very loud to too many. The monthly rations are distributed in small neighborhood shops. So you find the nearest shop here around Hoover, and you go to the shop, and you line up 10 or 15 deep every day. So whatever else you're doing with your time in life, you're going to have to get back to the basics. Line up and get your allocation of beans, eggs, a chicken, coffee, and rice, and even toilet paper. You're dependent on the government. Americans can hardly even fathom what that kind of a life would be like. But it's these principles that have brought it about. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. The theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. Direct violation, I said, of Scripture. Socialism is refuted all over the place in the Bible. Here would be one where God's the main character in this parable. He said, do I not have a right to do with my things as I want? Not mistreating you, I'm paying you what I said I would pay you. And so, see, that's all free enterprise. Capitalism. Abolition of private property. The government confiscates and takes over. Now, I hope that you understand, as I do, and I know you do, that to a Christian, skin color means nothing. At least that's the way it ought to be with all of us. We all ought to have the attitude that God expressed in 1 Samuel 16 when he told Samuel to go select a successor to Saul, and Saul saw that oldest son of Jesse, who was a military boy, probably had big gleaming shiny muscles, and said, this is him. And God said, no. I don't look at the appearance like you do. Okay, there's a godly approach to life. You don't look at how people look. You don't pay attention to their hair color, eye color, skin color, height, shortness, weight. Those are not factors that we take into account in dealing with people. We take into account moral principles, Christian concepts, you see. So this isn't about that. This is about what is your belief system that has spread like wildfire across our country. And notice that Patrice Cullors, she was pressed, by the way, by a radio announcer, said, you know, here's this movement of yours. I don't really see any ideological underpinnings. What drives your movement? What are you about? And she said, we have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. Now you can't get any clearer than that. So we believe communism and socialism and Marxism is the way to go. And therefore, our movement is designed to do everything we can to advance those ideologies, and therefore we hate Christianity, capitalism, and free enterprise. I'm telling you, that's where they're coming from. Are there things that you and I ought to be involved in to promote racial acceptance and equality and all? Absolutely. But that's not what this is about. That's the ruse. That's the cover for what's actually taking place here, folks. If Americans don't wake up and realize this is happening all over the country, when you look at the polls of the, what do they call, not Generation X, the millennials, I believe it's topped the majority believe. What's the problem with Marxism and socialism? What's the problem? Well, your forefathers fought and died to stop it from coming to these shores, I'll tell you that. And it's anti-biblical. It's anti-God. And we'd better get to studying in order to understand this. Do you remember Margaret Thatcher? She and Reagan were good buddies. She was a great British stateswoman. She said socialism in all its incarnations, wherever and however it was applied, was morally corrupting. When I read that, I thought, what are you talking about? And so you got to study, dig in and try to figure out what's happening. And here's what I concluded. It's anti-God, anti-Christian, anti-Bible, and anti-American, but our concern, of course, is the Bible. Number one, it inherently promotes covetousness and greed. Now you think, no, capitalism does that. No, it doesn't. It does not. But socialism does, because it creates within the society a desire to look at what other people have and say, well, I deserve that too, and I want that too, and the government ought to get that for me. So there's covetousness of other people's things, you see. That's built into it. And you're aware of the passages that teach that ought not to be the attitude of God's people. We don't look at other people's cars and clothes and bank accounts and gadgets and so forth and say, well, I ought to have that too, and have a covetous attitude. We better not do that. That's anti-Christian. It also promotes, by definition, envy and jealousy, which James made very clear is very unchristian, and wherever it occurs, it creates confusion and every evil thing. That's clearly verified by the countries where this dominates. And look at what Solomon had to say about the envy that comes about. And then thirdly, socialism is a form of stealing. What's it matter whether a person comes up to you with a gun and takes something from yours at gunpoint, or the government doing the same thing without the gun? See, that's an infringement on your unalienable right. They have no right to do that. So socialism, by definition, takes the property of some of the citizens and redistributes it to other citizens. That's what it's about. And notice the decisions about who to redistribute it to are made not by the citizens that they take the money from, but by their own ideological background. It enables the government to steal from some citizens and without their consent give it to others. But wait a minute, didn't the early Church of Christ practice socialism? I've actually read commentaries that say this is Christian socialism. That's a poor choice of words. because it does not share the fundamental principles of socialism. Remember what happened in the first Church of Christ on the planet, Jerusalem, very unique. It was the first church composed of Jews, according to Acts 2:5, from every nation. They came from all over. Why? Well, they were Jews, and they were coming there for the dual festivals of Passover and Pentecost. They had brought enough provisions in order to achieve that pilgrimage, you see. And then they could go back home. They never dreamed that they would be converted and embrace Christianity. And obviously didn't want to immediately go home then. They were enjoying life in the kingdom, this whole new change in their lives. And so they hung around longer than they had obviously intended. And the result was that they began to get low on provisions. And so the apostles recommended that people bring whatever they wanted to bring, whether it's property, they could sell it, bring the money or whatever, in order to help these fellow Christians that had just become Christians, in order to enable them to be able to survive and then gradually get back home. All of this was strictly voluntary. Wasn't the government, not commanded, simply reported to us. Civil government not in any way involved. It's just Christians individually in concert orchestrating this immediate need. We've been doing that all along, haven't we? That's what Christians do. You read through the rest of the New Testament, and this wasn't intended to be prototypical, because it was that unique situation where people were converted out of Judaism all at one place at one time for a very brief period. Think about this healthcare thing. If you go study socialism and communism, they will tell you this has always been a centerpiece of our ideology, because it's the largest intrusion of the government into an economy. You get that, everything else falls into line. Whenever you remember, a few years ago, this began to be advocated. Look at this article. This is Fidel Castro. And look what he said. It is really incredible that 234 years after the Declaration of Independence, the government of that country, meaning us, has approved medical attention for the majority of its citizens, something that we did half a century ago. Yeah, because you coerced it on the nation. You're a socialist. You're a Marxist. So he's praising that? That doesn't necessarily make it wrong. But I'd sure sit up and pay attention when someone like that praises something that was part of his revolution and part of his ideology. Again, I don't mean to get into politics and pick on one president over another. They've all got flaws. But look at these headlines. Redistributive change, redistributive justice, income inequality. You've heard those terms. Maybe you didn't pause. You're busy and think about what's he saying? What's he talking about? In fact, it sounds Christian, doesn't it? Share. Nope, that's not what this is. The equalization of property and wealth ownership by direct political fiat. It includes taxation designed to move wealth from one group to another, land reform and other means to promote equality of result over equality of opportunity. It's associated with Marxism, socialism, the transition from aristocracy or other forms of oligarchy to more broadly based governments. Redistributive justice is exercised by government through taxation or expropriation of property. Redistributive justice removes wealth from some members of society under the government's jurisdiction through governmental powers to the benefit of others that the government determines as in need or deserving. This is a violation of one of our inalienable rights. So it's not sharing, it's the government forcibly confiscating from some citizens and then reallocating to those that they deem ought to receive it. Here is what Michael Tanner said of the Cato Institute. Nobody in America is poor today just because somebody else is rich. That's one of the myths of socialism and communism. The academic literature is very solid on what it takes for people to lift themselves out of economic hardship. Graduate, get an education, and if you're not married, don't be having babies out of wedlock, and get a job and work 40 hours or more a week, and you can do anything in this country. So why would the government be involved in this at all? Unless a person is physically deformed or something where they can't work, sure. The elderly, sure. That's not what's going on in our country. We've got a lot of able-bodied people that are being encouraged to be indigent and lazy and into mischief because they receive enough sustenance from the government that they can do that. I'm telling you, this is sinful. This is wicked. We're hurting people. Look at this illustration. This college professor was talking with them, he's economics, about socialism. Of course, all the kids, oh, socialism's great. Okay, I want you all to know that I recently failed an entire class because of this insistence. And what I decided to do was to have a little experiment. So we traded dollars for grades. Traded grades for dollars in order for them to see the principle. All grades could be averaged, and everyone then would receive the same grade, you see. So everybody benefits. No one would fail. Of course, nobody would receive an A, but hey, you wouldn't fail. Here's how it went. First test, the grades were averaged. Everyone got a B. Well, that made the people that hadn't studied happy. But the ones that studied hard because they wanted an A, they needed an A for their future life, they were not happy. When the second test rolled around, the students who studied little had studied even less. And the ones who had studied hard decided, well, why do that? I'll just get a free ride too. Second test average was a D. No one was happy. When the third test rolled around, the average was an F. With each test, the scores never increased. The students bickered, blamed each other, name-calling. That's what socialism does to a society. Do you not see that you're striking at the very heart of beings who have been created in the image of God? This is in direct conflict with that principle. I wouldn't expect non-Christians to understand that. And that's been the case historically with socialists. They're not Christians. The professor told them that socialism would also ultimately fail because when the reward is great, the effort to succeed is great. When the government takes all the reward away, no one will try or want to succeed. Why are businesses right now, by the way, I'm sure you're hearing this here too, like in Montgomery, businesses are having trouble finding people to work. You know what the liberal answer to that is? You know, they explain everything away and will not ever face things that they need to face. Well, it's because of COVID. People are afraid to go back to work. I don't believe that's true because a lot of people are back to work. They don't have an incentive to go back. They're used to dealing with less, and so they'll just accept the free ride and stay at home in their PJs. I'm concerned about members of the church that have altered their view of worship based on this same thinking. This U.S. rep from Texas, you cannot multiply wealth by dividing it. You cannot legislate the poor into freedom and wealth by legislating the wealthy out of it. Government cannot give the people anything that the government does not first take from somebody else. That which one man receives without working for, another man must work for without receiving. When half of the people get the idea they don't have to work because the other half is going to take care of them, and when the other half gets the idea it does no good to work because somebody else is going to get what they work for, that, my dear friend, is about the end of any nation. Let me wind this up with these observations. Should the federal government provide welfare, that is, monthly funds for the poor and needy? Again, in this book, I go into great detail on all of these points. Don't have time. Number one, it redirects the central function of human government as defined in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 to a different purpose. Number two, it's contrary to the ultimate law of our land. It's really unconstitutional. It violates our founding principles. But look at this one. It's degrading to human nature, the psyche as created by God. What are you talking about? If you were to visit the Montgomery Zoo and go to the monkey cages, you would see this sign. Please don't feed the zoo animals. It causes all kinds of trouble. Look at the last one. Unnatural behavior. Public feeding promotes begging in our wild animals, which is unnatural and degrading. Okay. So what about that? Welfare is degrading to the human spirit. It steals human dignity, reducing a person to slavery and dependency. It damages one's self-concept. It kills initiative. It fosters laziness and inactivity. It makes stealing seem acceptable. Hey, if the rest of the citizens have the obligation to give me a check every month, well then I deserve it and they owe it to me. So what would it matter whether I steal it? Go take their lawnmower. It causes a person to become more dependent to where he expects others to give it to him. That's pride. It creates a victim mentality in which the person thinks others rather than himself must rescue him. If not done scripturally, that is helping poor people. It fosters illicit use of funds. Oh, you're going to pay for my next meal? Well, then I'll take the resources I was going to use to pay for my food and go get cigarettes. How many of you are old enough to remember the World War II generation saying things like, we never took charity. We would never take anything from the government. It was like a big thing with them. And they went through the Great Depression. But they were adamant about it. To fend for themselves, to work hard, and to feed their families. See, they got the concept. They understood the... Where'd that come from, by the way? That's Christianity. Those are Christian principles taken from God's Word. And it was embedded in those people. It's virtually completely lost now in the country in which we live. Never mind all the passages that teach that work is not bad. You know, that's one reason why all these gambling casinos are wrong. They're literally seeking to circumvent the work ethic. Oh man, if I could win the lottery, then I would what? Wouldn't have to work. Oh, so you think work is bad? Yeah. Well, God doesn't feel that way about it. God wants human beings to be industrious and to work and to labor. It's part of the necessary process of fashioning and shaping our spirits, just like spanking does to children. There's things going on there that's not immediately apparent. No wonder then Paul would say, just outright brazenly, if you will not work, you're not to be given anything to eat. That's one reason why I will never hand money to a guy at the street corner. Because I may very well be violating that passage if I don't know his situation. Oh, but Americans, you know, we're so benevolent and friendly, and we just open the window and toss them some money. We better go back and read our Bibles. We may be exacerbating the situation, enabling that individual, and pushing him deeper into this condition of confusion and inappropriate behavior. The speaker last week went a little bit over, didn't he? Does that mean I can? Because I'm about to wind this up. And I think it'd be better to end it here so that when I come back, we can move on to a new subject. You know who this fellow was? You know, we've lost our history, but these were the forefathers of our forefathers. 150 years earlier, see. Old William Bradford, very prominent in all of that. This is that famous picture where they're on the deck of the Speedwell. They've left Holland, where they had fled from England because they were being persecuted, and now they're heading to America. Notice what's he holding there? That's the Bible. See that rainbow in the upper left? That is a symbol for God. You can go onto the government website and see the details about this. That's William Bradford back there kneeling behind the first governor, John Carver. Miles Standish over here. These, are all famous people, if you remember that. And this is when they actually remember they got to the shores of America. They didn't get off the ship until they got together and said, okay, how are we going to run this thing? Basically forming a government. On-board ship signed the Mayflower Compact, and there is William Bradford once again. Now what's fascinating is he left this writing that you can go online, Google Books, free of charge, just download it. History of Plymouth Plantation. Look at this. They decided there on board that ship, all profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, by the way, is not, semis or anything like that. Working, fishing, or any other means of any person or persons remain still in the common stock until the division. So everybody that works in this community, we're going to bring all of their proceeds of their work and put it in a common stock. You see, that's socialism. And then it'll be doled out by who? All such persons as are of this colony are to have their meat, drink, apparel, and all provisions out of the common stock and goods of said colony. Okay? So guess what? It's been tried before here in America. That led to starvation and failure. And let me prove it to you. He says it did. Notice the Old English here. They began to think how they might raise as much corn as they could and obtain a better crop when they had, by the way, so it led to misery and confusion, and they failed. A lot of people died too. So then they thought, okay, what are we going to do? They began to think how they might raise as much corn as they could and obtain a better crop than they had done, that they might not still thus languish in misery. At length, after much debate of things, the governor, with the advice of the chiefest among them, gave way that they should set corn every man for his own particular. That is, give each person their own property to grow their own corn, and in that regard trust to themselves, and in all other things to go on in the general way as before. And so assigned to every family a parcel of land according to the proportion of their number for that end, only for present use, but made no division for inheritance. They didn't like the nobility stuff of inheritance and all the lands owned by just the nobles. The rank and file people can't have any. And ranged all the boys and youth under some family. This had very good success, for it made all lands very industrious, so much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means the governor or any other could use, and saved him a great deal of trouble and gave far better content. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before would allege weakness and inability. I don't feel like going out in the field today. Why? What's the use? Whom to have compelled would have been thought great tyranny. They try to, okay, everybody get out of bed, you got to go. No. Parents can do that to their kids, but you can't have the government doing that. The experience that was had in this common course and condition, tried sundry years, and that amongst godly and sober men, may well evince the vanity of that conceit of Plato's and other ancients applauded by some of later times, that the taking away of property and bringing in community into a commonwealth would make them happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. See, there's what socialists think. We're wiser than God. For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For the young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong or man of parts had no more in division of victuals and clothing than he that was weak and not able to do a quarter of what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men to be ranked and equalized in labors and victuals, clothes, with a meaner, meaning a commoner and younger sort, thought it some indignity and disrespect unto them. And for men's wives to be commanded to do service for other men as dressing their meat, washing their clothes, they deemed it a kind of slavery. Neither could many husbands well brook it. Upon the point, all being to have alike and all to do alike, they thought themselves in like condition, and one as good as another. And so, if it did not cut of those relations that God hath set amongst men, yet it did at least much diminish and take of the mutual respects that should be preserved amongst them, and would have been worse if they had been men of another condition. That is, it's not that these people are rabble or anything and don't want to work. These are the best. These are Christian people. Imagine how the colony would have failed miserably if you had had people of lesser principles and moral values. Let none object, this is men's corruption. That's Calvinism. And nothing to course itself. I answer, seeing all men have this corruption in them, God in his wisdom saw another course fitter for them. So this approach is clearly in harmony with God's will. God wants men to share with each other and to assist the vulnerable. However, he wants this done out of free will. Okay? Are Americans the most generous people on the planet? Statistically, that is a proven fact. Okay? So why? Christianity. So that's the way to do it. You want to help the people that are in need of help? Don't turn it over to the government. Promote Christianity in the school system. That's a novel idea. That's the way it was from the very beginning. All right, the close then. By this time, harvest was come, and instead of famine, now God gave them plenty. And the face of things was changed to rejoicing of the hearts of many, for which they blessed God. And the effect of their particular planning was well seen, for all had, one way and another, pretty well to bring the year about. And some of the abler sort and more industrious had to spare and sell to others, so as any general want or famine hath not been amongst them since to this day. That would be a good place for us to pause. So it's been tried before. Socialism has been tried on our shores, and it failed. And here is history working hard to repeat itself. What's astounding about all this to me is the extent to which the Bible discusses these matters to help our country pull itself out of the decline that we are witnessing. And who is going to do that? It's going to be the church. It's going to be Christians pronouncing to the four winds God's views on these critical matters. All right, thank you for your kind attention. Lord willing, July 28th, I think. We'll pick up there and look at I want to show you how God handled taxation under the law of Moses. And was there socialism? And how were the poor taken care of? And if we get time to go to immigrants, what was God's view about immigration? You're going to be shocked if you haven't studied it out for yourself. All right, thank you.